Welcome to this live cast on our future economies. Capitalism, despite the tremendous increase in worldwide welfare through its innovative power and freedom, has at the same time a number of negative consequences. A transition is necessary to overcome ecological destruction, decrease in quality of life, and growing inequality. Given geopolitical developments, Europe has an important role to play in this transition. In the livecasts, we will start an open dialogue and discuss this transition with internationally renowned economists from all over the world. Questions will pass by, such as each week, we will discuss these matters with 2 economists, resulting in 10 online dialogues in 10 weeks, where we will share viewpoints and collect ideas on how capitalism's innovative and creative powers can go hand in hand with fostering an equal and just society. A different subject every week. Together we can build a basis for economies that are beneficial to all of us. You can participate by putting your questions and remarks in the chat. So, let's talk.
Thank you, Professor Steinberger, for being here with us tonight. Tonight we're discussing how we can reconcile markets with ecology. Now, when discussing ecology, one almost immediately touches upon the issue of growth. And in an article you published on Open Democracy in April this year, you make the case that the way Western governments have responded to the initial developments of the corona crisis has shown that we are indeed growth obsessed. Now, the first question I'd like to ask you is, what do you mean by that? What does it amount to that governments or we, our economies, are growth obsessed?
Thanks for that question. Hi, everybody. It's really nice to be here. So the way that our governments are growth obsessed, the way I described it in the article is that there are 3 different ways. One is that governments see their role and their usefulness as contributing to economic growth. And I think that there is a big rejoinder to the question that we were asked at the beginning about this role of materialism and consumption and this philosophy of unbridled materialism and short-termism. This is not necessarily, I would say, something that's caused by consumers. I would say that the consumer society is actually the result of a growth-oriented economy. A growth-oriented economy has to create consumers because it's constantly overproducing. So our governments tend to view their success as related to how much they can enable the economy to grow, and everything else becomes secondary. So even the health of the planet, even the health of their own citizens, they don't see those goals as primordial anymore. So they have a wrong focus on what could and should be done for correct governance. I think that that's one way. The other way is that we have the structural imperative to growth through the way that capitalism operates, which is the increasing pursuit of profits. And because of that, there's no choice within a capitalist economy. In order to survive, firms have to compete with each other and have to pursue growth. And so that's sort of baked into the way our markets operate. Mm-hmm. And so these things are quite structurally foundational of our current economies.
So do you think that it's possible? Can the conditions for a new economy, for example, based on the principles of ecology, exist under capitalism or under a for-profit logic?
I think that if capitalism is to be maintained, it has to be, so I'm quite critical of capitalism, not just fossil capitalism, not just unequal capitalism, the whole thing. I don't think capitalism has a lot of options, actually. I think it has to be extractive and it has to be unequal. It drives inequality. Thomas Piketty has shown this very clearly. One of the great economists of our time who happens to look at real numbers. So I think that we can try to do something quite different. And the way that we do something quite different has to be through social movements. So it has to come back to democracy. It has to come back to people power. Mm-hmm. And I think that movements like the climate strikes, like the Sunrise Movement in the US, and like the Just Transition, as it was mentioned in its original bottom-up formulation, that has to do with working people who want their work and their active potential to really contribute to something positive in society. I think that that's a very different direction.
Yeah. So how has the corona crisis currently shown us that we are indeed in this predicament, that we are too growth dependent?
The coronavirus it's accelerated. It's sort of been an accelerated crash test of what a lot of us have already been seeing happening with the climate crisis, which is that our governments are just not taking, first of all, don't take it seriously enough, don't act fast enough faced with an exponential problem. They're not acting in terms of preventative measures. They're not taking the precautionary principle of protecting people. And what we see is that they take decisions that are expedient to their friends, to their economic priorities, to their, in the UK, we have all kinds of scandals about who received contracts for medical equipment even, so that they're really behaving in a way that's very detrimental to the long-term health of most of the population. And for climate, it's been exactly the same, but on a longer time scale. And so I would say that the two situations are very similar. The kinds of dysfunction we're seeing with corona are the same kinds that we have been seeing play out for decades with climate.
Yeah. Now, we're discussing economics tonight, of course, but we also necessarily have to touch upon the topic of politics. And in your article, you describe the kind of political style which we've seen over the last couple of decades here in the West, politicians and politics on the basis of absence instead of presence, right? Focusing on markets. Have politicians over time perhaps transferred some accountability to the market? Have they used it to that extent?
Yes. So one of the ways that that our current economic system works is it's sort of eating itself. It's like the snake eating its own tail, and it works on debt. And this is something that Anne Pettifor knows a lot more about than I do, and is a leading expert in. So I'm just going to sketch out what this means in terms of the government. Is that we have governments and households actually as well that have been sort of caught into the debt spiral and selling off assets, selling off productive capacity in exchange for short-term financial relationships, where you're sort of making the books balance a bit better that year, but in the long term, you're in more and more debt. So one of the problems with our governments is that they've actually turned over to the private sector in very financialized ways the very assets that would allow us to protect ourselves from the perspective of public investment, public reorientation. So we have utilities, transport system, most of our infrastructure, our health systems are very much privatized. They are in fact privatized, even if they are not overtly, even if there's still the NHS or whatever label or public health above the door, the privatization is still happening. And that means that our governments are sort of they have this ideology of leaving things to the market, but also in very real ways, they've dispossessed themselves of the economic power for orienting how they could protect us. And they have to go through these market mechanisms that are often very costly and costly in the future as well. You're really putting yourself into a relationship where you commit year after year to be paying these companies regardless of what else you might want to do. Yeah,
clear. So you mentioned some of these structural elements that we need to address. What of these elements, three, you mentioned, is the most keen that we tackle today? Which should we focus on right now?
I think right now I would focus on exposing these mechanisms as a form of corruption. So I think that the only way we get through this is by a revival of democracy, and by a revival of democracy that takes the economic sphere into its orbit, where we do not allow important life or death decisions to be made by the market. The market is not a neutral law of nature. It's not just something out there that just exists on its own and makes the best decisions for us, like Adam Smith hoped it would. It is basically directed by very rich individuals who are accumulating wealth, including accumulating extraordinary wealth during our time of crisis, of the corona crisis. And these same people will accumulate during the climate crisis as well. They will always find ways to make money out of misery. So we need to turn this into a question of democracy, and we need to have a democracy that takes economics in with it. So I think that it has to do a lot with education, with journalism, exposing corruption, exposing this unfair and unequal accumulation that's detrimental to the rest of us. And it has to do with imagining new forms of the economy that are democratic, where our decision-making includes what happens in the economy. We don't say, oh, this doesn't concern us anymore, this is beyond our control. We say, no, actually, as citizens, we are also part of the economy, and we get to decide what firms do, how much they profit, how much bosses get paid, how much salary differential there is, what the purpose of a firm is. Should it be to accumulate profit? Should we even allow that? Is that actually a pro-social behavior? We give every firm, every economic entity that operates in our economies, we give them social license. And I think for a lot of them, it's time to take social license away, including for the fossil fuel companies, but including probably quite a few others.
So who should take the lead in this change you envision?
I think that quite a few groups are already doing a lot. And I think that, for instance, the youth climate movement, so the climate strikes, Fridays for Future are doing quite a bit. I think that certain alliances around the European Green New Deal have been trying to do quite a bit. So I know that the Zoe Institute and economic think tanks like the New Economics Foundation or the Next System Foundation, I think they're called in the US. So there are a lot of groups that are thinking about alternative economics in really creative ways, and they're allied with popular movements that are basically youth movements that really are challenging the status quo very, very openly in a way that previous environmental movements did not allow themselves to do. They sort of really position themselves more as a fringe topic. Now these groups are bringing the environment and social justice together in the center of a core challenge to our current economic systems. And so I think that that's the kind of the work we need to be joining in with.
Yeah. So in this series, we have often seen that where difficulty comes in is that although we have good policies that maybe a majority of the people agrees on, or that we know that we need to take action on right now, what is actually required is also a political climate in which these ideas can come to fruition. Do you have any thoughts on how we can work to create such an environment?
I think that one of the most important things from my perspective is really to expose corruption and to expose the work of, for instance, deliberate disinformation that's been happening on the climate side. We know for decades that these companies have been doing this kind of disinformation. The automotive industry is not far behind. The automotive industry is right up there with the great disinformers. So I think we need to make a transparent case for why these industries don't have the right to operate and don't have the right to dictate policies, certainly, in the way that they used to. And the only way to do that, to create the political climate that allows us to do that, is to create the awareness of how angry we should be by the ways that our economies have been manipulated and our politicians and leaders have been lied to and been complicit in this kind of grand corruption where we're now facing these multiple crises. These crises were avoidable. Both the coronavirus and the climate crisis are avoidable crises because we've known about at least their potential for a very long time. And so I think we have every right to be angry, and we have every right through that anger and through that awareness that we really need to change quite a bit to create the political climate we need.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor Steinberger. Looking forward to discussing this with you at length during our discussion session. Let's move on for now.